Welcome everyone to our third anti-Black racism roundtable discussion for August. Now we do the land acknowledgement. Today we honor and acknowledge that this land and locality in which we live, move, and breathe is the historical traditional lands of the indigenous peoples of what we call Turtle Island and what is commonly called North America. As we journey together, may we seek the path of justice, reconciliation, and renewal. May we commit ourselves to be partners in healing and peace to the glory and thanksgiving of God, our Creator. This is the Black Anglicans of Canada Declaration. We, as people of African descent, are commissioned and called to be ambassadors of reconciliation. We are called to create opportunities and space for courage building, healing, fellowship, and empowerment. This special calling is both a reminder and a challenge to ourselves and to the whole church that we are no longer destined to just obey, suffer, and witness, but to disrupt, heal, and lead. And our vision, just a quick on our vision, we envision the Anglican Church of Canada as a faith community that values and respects the rich diversity of Black people who are empowered to enjoy equitable participation, representation, and a sense of belongingness with inclusion in the mission of Jesus Christ and in the full life of the Anglican Church. The mission I will not read, we will proceed. And these are greater details on those things. These are some of the persons who are the leadership team, sorry, not some, the leadership team. Reverend Jacqueline, Lance Wilson, Anita Gittins, Brother Reginald Crenshaw, Reverend Vernon Savage, Yvonne Murray, Dolores Lawrence, and our patron, Bishop Peter Fenty. Let me welcome Dr. Nemoy Lewis, Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at University of Toronto, and he's going to be focusing on the topic, Anti-Black Racism in Housing, Secrets Revealed. Let me just do a brief introduction. Well, you can go to the next slide. I know many of you might be able to read it quickly, so let me do that quickly for you. Nemoy Lewis is a Provost Doctoral Research Fellow at the University of Toronto. His PhD work explored the 2008 foreclosure crisis and its impact on racialized people in the United States. His current research explores the growing affordability and displacement problems impacting Black renters since the financialization of the rental markets in Toronto. In his previous postdoctoral research, Nemoy examined the economic and social impact of scholarships on the lives of Black students across Ontario, Canada. Nemoy has co-authored a paper on race and urban politics in Ferguson, Missouri, in the leading geography journal, Environmental and Planning, D, Society and Space in 2016, and a book chapter for a special collection, Gentrification as a Global Strategy, Neil Smith and Beyond, Routledge, 2018. He has also contributed to a chapter in the book entitled Neoliberal Chicago, 2017. His current research interests are urban and housing policies, Black geographies, and processes of financialization in housing markets. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nemoy, and we can stop sharing. I think he wants to share a screen now too as well. Welcome, Nemoy.
You're muted.
Oh, there we go. Thank you everyone for joining us today to hear my talk. And Today I'm going to be talking about the housing crisis that we have here in Ontario, or just across Canada. So I'm going to begin. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to begin to talk about how we arrived here. So, like I said, with my bio, my introduction, my research, my PhD work focused a lot on the U.S. foreclosure crisis, and looking at the way that it impacted Black homeowners in both Chicago and Jacksonville, Florida, and looking at how foreclosures disproportionately impacted the African American community in the United States. And so pretty much how I arrived here was looking at how Wall Street entities, primarily private equity firms and asset management firms, have looked to capitalize on the crisis itself that they helped to create. Then we're moving forward to talking about race and the financialization of the rental market. So primarily looking at financialization of Toronto's rental market, and looking at how public pension funds interest in the multifamily sector has sort of changed the rental landscape in Toronto, and looking at their entanglement with private equity and asset management firms. Primarily for this talk, we're going to be looking at two entities, Blackstone Group, and which is one of the largest private equity firms in the world, which is based in New York, and Starlight Investment, which is based here in Toronto. And we're going to be looking at some of their various strategies within the multifamily sector and how those particular investment strategies impact on the affordability and displacement problems that we currently have in the Toronto's rental market. And then lastly, just some final remarks on how COVID has sort of helped to exacerbate those problems of evictions and displacements within Black communities. So how did we arrive here? So as millions of African-American families were being evicted from their home, Wall Street entities were waiting in line to capitalize on their losses by acquiring distressed properties to bolster their rental portfolio. The growth of the rental market presented a unique opportunity for Wall Street to extract exuberant profits as millions of new renters entered the market. Financialization of the rental market in turn facilitated even more insidious forms of racialized dispossession. As stated by Blackstone's co-founder, Chief Executive Stephen Schwarzman, who said right after the foreclosure crisis started to unfold, oh my goodness, this could be huge. Nobody's going to be able to borrow. They're all going to need housing. So since 2011, some of the world's largest private equity firms and hedge funds, as well as other large institutional investors, have spent a combined $70 billion to acquire distressed properties at steep discounts and charging as much as 180% of fair market rent on more than 200 homes in the alien markets across the United States. Blackstone, the nation's largest investor and owner of single-family homes alone, spent $10 billion in acquiring 50,000 homes in the past 2 years. And in 2017, they merged with the second largest institutional landlord in the United States, Starwood Waypoint Homes, making it the country's largest landlord with 82,000 properties. Wall Street private equity Goliath Blackstone Group helped to develop a sophisticated product known as rent-backed securities to purchase a lot of these properties, allowing Wall Street entities to profit again from the mess, as I said, they created in 2008. Rent-backed securities work very similar to mortgage-backed securities, with the exceptions that rental payments are what is used to pay bondholders rather than mortgage payments. And since their debut in 2000, and since the introduction of rent-backed securities, they've ballooned into a $20 billion industry. So how I arrived here, or just before I go further, so this is a map of showing over 80,000 properties that they own across the United States. Blackstone has also ventured into Canada in doing joint ventures with Starlight Investment in Canada in acquiring a number of multifamily properties. So what is financialization? Financialization is the increasing dominance of financial actors, markets, and practices, and measurements and narratives at various scales, resulting in the structural transformation of economies, including financial institutions, states, and households. So what you have in the context of housing is that housing is being valued for its exchange value rather than its use value. And in terms of within the rental sector, private equity firms are acquiring underutilized assets, so underutilized multifamily rentals across Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and other major cities in Canada, and improving the efficiencies by them by reducing some of the expenses and increasing rents in order to pay their investors. So public pensions. So for decades, public pensions have been suffering from a shortfall, and pensions have moved away from acquiring corporate and government bonds in order to bridge these gaps, because largely 10-year government bonds are not as lucrative as they once were 20 years ago. And as a result, pension funds have been looking to alternative asset classes, such as multifamily dwellings, as a way to help bridge that gap. And as a result, they've been increasing their investments in the multifamily sector, and part of this increase is they've moved from 11% about a decade ago to where these asset class now account for about 26% of their portfolio interest. So they're investing a lot of these funds in private equity firms and asset management firms, who then go out and acquire these properties and turn them into income generating assets. So some of these pension funds, pensions, I'm sure that you guys are familiar with. The Canada Pension Investment Board, OMERS, which is the Ontario Municipal, which manages Ontario municipal employees' pensions, and BCI is the comparable in British Columbia. PSP is the investment board that manages federal employees' public pensions. And OpTrust is the pension that manages the Ontario provincial employees' pensions. So as you can see here from this chart, the investments in 10-year bonds have been decreasing over time, and as a result, pension funds have been looking to the multifamily sector to help to bridge those funding shortfalls, as I talked about earlier. And as you can see, after 2008, we see that the gap in terms of the interest that could be earned on the investments in these particular sectors grew, and as over time, more institutional funds went into multifamily dwellings, those basis points have decreased. So when I talk about 354, it's the difference of 3.54%, and in 2009 that decreased to 3.22%. And the combination of lower monthly costs and increased long-term security has only intensified the demand for purpose-built rentals. And as you can see from this chart, investment in the multifamily sector reached its all-time high in 2018, where the level of activity within the sector of acquisitions topped out at $8.3 billion. And just in the first quarter of 2019, they were already at $4.4 billion. And much of that activity is taking place in the Toronto and Montreal markets, and Vancouver would be the next market. So the total annualized returns on Canadian multifamily sector was about 9.8% in the first quarter in 2019. So hefty returns enticed investors within a multifamily investment volume, reaching a record, as I stated earlier, of $8.3 billion. And part of the reason for this this level of activity and this interest is because the cost of housing, or the cost of ownership in Canada has grown significantly, and as a result, home ownership is out of reach for a number of households across the country, and as a result, many households are forced to rent their housing. So some of the strategies that they deploy are a value-added strategies. So they would do in-suite renovations, as you can see from the chart. So they might upgrade the appliances, put in a breakfast bar, or they might add, put in parks or pools or gym, etc., to help boost the value of the particular property. They might also engage in some exterior renovations, such as the painting of the exterior walls, or they might replace the metal facing on a lot of the balconies to a glass material to help give the impression of condo-style living in some of our post-war suburban areas of the city of Toronto. So one way that they pay for these improvements is through above guideline increases. And so each investment that they make in terms of investments within the common amenities or some of the common areas of the building, those costs are then downloaded onto the tenant to actually pay, which then helps to exacerbate the affordability problems within the particular building. But when I stress about the affordability problems, I'm not just talking about the affordability problems that then occur with the increase in the rents. Affordability problems is more there's a broader effect of the impact of these the impact of increase in the rents, because part of what the reason why private equity firms are making these investments is in turn to try to attract more higher income households to rent in these particular buildings, and as a result, creating a displacement problem within some of these communities, but even further stimulating the gentrification process in some of these communities. So the argument that I'm trying to make here is that private equity's high yield targets adversely affect Black tenants. So when private equity implements cost-cutting measures to maximize their short-term value because they prioritize returns over risk, and pension funds, and just to go back to pension funds typically are risk averse, so they want to go into investments that have a lower risk profile. And multifamily provides that sort of similar profile characteristics as government and corporate bonds. So this was an ideal investment opportunity for pension funds to help bridge those gaps. So as I talked about earlier with the value-added strategies with improvements within the facings of the balcony, this is a property at the corner of Eglinton Avenue West and Marley Avenue, which was also acquired by an institutional landlord. The next particular property is a property that is located at Black Creek and Stewie, which is in the old borough of the city of York. And the particular property that we're looking at is 25 Martin Eaton Way, which is owned by Real Star, which is another institutional landlord that operates not just only in Ontario, but across the country. And this particular property that we're looking at, they invested about just under $20 million in investments in 420 units, and including the exterior units, to help with the value added strategy to improve the value. So just as a rough calculation, for a particular property like this, if you can increase if you can increase the operating income, the net operating income of these particular properties by, let's say, just $50,000 by, cost cutting measures such as cutting back on some of the repairs, cutting back on some of the maintenances, and or even removing the superintendent out of the building, because that's one unit that would not be providing you with generating income. So you want to have all the units helping you to generate enough income to pay your investors. And so with this particular property, they made all these investments, and then right after applied for above guideline increase, and increase the rents in this particular unit each unit by average of about 4 to 5%. And one of the things when you apply for these above guideline increases, some of these above guideline increases pay for the actual capital investments that's made in these particular buildings, sometimes 3 to 4 times over, because once these above guideline increases help to pay for those investments, a landlord is not required to then remove that percentage, that increase in the rent thereafter. So it essentially continues on to the future. So another particular process strategy that they use is squeezing, which is essentially trying to squeeze as much rent as possible out of tenants without actually making any additional investments into the particular property. So as I talked about, like for this year, for example, the rental increase guideline for this year is about 2.2%. So if you have, if you're currently paying $1,000 for rent at a 2.2% increase, that would increase your rent by about $22. And for some families, or for some low-income families or households that are on a fixed income, that adds up over time, and it can essentially help to reduce the quality of life for some households, because some families are then either forced to choose between paying the rents or putting a roof over their families' heads. And the next issue that when you increase the rents through these rental increase guidelines, you don't actually have to do any investment. So you can, an institutional landlord can acquire a particular property and right off the bat increase the rents by 2.2%, and that can generate an additional $7,000 in income, depending on how many units are in the building each month, and generating about over additional $20,000 plus annually. So the higher rents and surcharges equals higher profits. So some of the surcharges that could include where, for instance, like you might go into a particular mid-rise apartment buildings, and they might not have assigned parking. And right off the bat, a lot of these institutional landlords will draw some lines, put some numbers indicating or corresponding parking space for individual units, and charge upwards of $50 to $100, and that's literally just drawing lines and putting some numbers on each parking spot, and that could generate an additional source of income for these institutional landlords. So again, like I talked about, it helps to decline living conditions, because there's no incentive for in this particular strategy for institutional landlords to make improvements to the units and with raising rents also increases the housing insecurity for some of these households. And typically these are happening in post-war suburban locations in Toronto. So in some of the old boroughs of Toronto, like the old city of York, North York, and parts of Scarborough. And they're also happening in racialized communities with high levels of poverty, and in areas where there's a high proportion of single parent households, primarily mothers. So as I talked about some of the displacement problems that it helps to create as well. So when tenants are unable to pay their rent, institutional landlords typically apply to the landlord-tenant boards to remove these tenants if non-paying tenants, largely because their returns are based on an investment model that requires there needs to be a certain level of occupancy of paying rent of tenants who are paying rents in order to meet their investors the returns that they've promised their investors. And so as you can see from this particular chart to the right, where it gives a list of number of properties across Ontario that have some of the highest eviction applications. The first particular property with the postal code M9V4C3 is a property located just west of Rexdale. It's at 2737 Kipling Avenue. And the next particular property, which has about 981 eviction applications, and this is the property that's next to the property that I mentioned earlier at 25 Martin Ethan Way. This is the property that's next to it at 15 Martin Ethan Way, and it has had about 900, just under 1,000 eviction applications over a 4-year span between 2012 and 2016. And as you can see, where some of the units, the ones that are highlighted, 10 Santa Romana Way, which is in the Jane and Finch community, and 160 Chalk Farm Avenue, which is just south of there at Jane and Wilson. And with some of these properties, at least 20% of the units within these properties have had at least one eviction. And as you can see from the other arrow, that there's only one property that is not within the city of Toronto. So a vast majority of the evictions that are happening in Ontario are within the Greater Toronto area, but primarily in Toronto. And this is an article that just came out earlier today, which highlights that some of the same neighborhoods that are hit by COVID are some of the same communities that are faced with these high eviction filings. And as you can see from the next chart, which similarly shows some of the communities that I talked about, the Black Creek community, which is the community that the 15 Martin Ethan Way is located, and it is one of the communities that have one of the highest eviction filings, but also it's one of the communities that are has one of the highest proportion of COVID-19 cases in Toronto. And as you can see, this is a map of the Black renter concentration in Toronto. And as you can see, much of the concentration is in the west and northwest parts of the city in terms of renters. And these particular community, Eglinton West community, and the Kingston Galloway community is one of the two communities that I'm focusing on my current research, which is looking at the impact of financialization, the financialization of the rental market and its impact on Black renters. And that's my presentation. And this is some of my publications, and a great resource that that would help to explain the impacts of financialization across the world is a documentary called Push, and a link below, a link right here is you can find that video, find the documentary that's now available on TVO for viewing for free. Thank you.
Thank you, Nemoy.
Thank you, Nemoy. Yes, Nemoy, just for that last information you gave us, I myself was writing it down. It's Push.
Push.
P-U-S-H, right?
Yes.
On TVO.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I could go back to the link.
Okay, please.
Could you put the link in the chat?
Oh, yes. Could you do that? I'd appreciate that. Thanks.
I'll put the link in the chat.
Okay, thank you. And what I'll do in the meantime is one looking for the questions that have been asked. Okay, you ready for the questions, Nemoy?
I'm ready.
Okay, first question. Is City Hall, the Ontario Ministry of Housing, aware that gentrification is taking place?
The city is aware. The city is aware of the problems of institutional landlords, but the problem is that there's not much the city can do. Other cities have sort of placed a cap on the number of properties that institutional landlords can own in order to prevent a monopoly of institutional landlords owning a large sum of the properties across the city. And currently right now, one of the largest landlords in the city of Toronto is an asset management firm called Starlight Investment, which I mentioned earlier,
Yes.
which are some of the properties that I highlighted in today's presentation. And so part of one of the things that part of one of their value added strategies, they're more of a long-term play where last year, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, talked about increasing the density along the transit lines. And so as a result, Starlight has been focusing a lot of their concentration along transit lines, but also getting ahead of the crowd by acquiring a large sum of multifamily properties along the Eglinton Crosstown LRT, which is the community that I'm focusing on. And so as a result, I'm kind of trying to look at how taxpayer dollars are being used to then invested in capital, invest capital within the infrastructure of the city that are then being used to attract private investment, which are then in turn being used to displace longstanding residents of a community.
Okay, thank you very much, Nemoy, for that response. And I have another one here. What are your thoughts on the solution to the housing crisis under this institutional investment?
So one of the things that I think that I think part of the thing that what I think the government needs to do is to invest more funds into affordable housing or purpose-built rentals. When the government got out of building purpose-built rentals, the assumption was that the private sector will then step in and build purpose-built rentals, but there was actually no money into building purpose-built rentals, and as a result, private interests focused a lot of their developments in building condominiums, and condominiums are not cheap, and as a result, there's a huge shortfall in terms of the amount of purpose-built rental units that are available as a result, these entities have noticed that the gap in terms of the number of purpose-built rental units that are available, and as a result, they're acquiring a large sums of these properties, but they're also noticing that a lot of these multifamily properties are being ran by mom and pop who don't have the institutional capital to make this sort of investment to actually improve or increase the income generation of these properties, and as a result, they're selling these properties to almost next to nothing. And a lot of these institutions are then buying these properties and then increasing the rent. So I think that there needs to be more investments in affordable housing, and less so much in terms of trying to encourage more home ownership, because I think the more that you provide or you subsidize home ownership in this country, the greater you essentially exacerbate the problems of displacement and affordability, because no one's actually building purpose-built rentals. So you're essentially exacerbating the affordability problems because you're essentially increasing the demand for home ownership, and as a result, it's increasing the price of home ownership in some of Canada's largest housing markets.
Okay, thank you, Nemoy. This one, years ago, people spoke of slum landlords in New York, where they did no work on their properties but kept raising the rents. So Canada now have their share of slum landlords. I want to have more is a statement from Ivadne. Okay, I will move to the next question. What are your thoughts on the solution to the housing crisis across Canada?
So I think, as I stated earlier, some of the solutions that I think that the government needs to invest more in purpose-built.
Okay.
The government needs to invest more in purpose-built rentals, and not so much relying on these these developers to build purpose-built rentals, or relying on developers to provide an allotment of, let's say, maybe 5 to 10% of their maybe even less than 5% of their development towards providing a number of affordable units within those particular developments. And the one thing that I should note is that when cities engage in these sort of partnerships, or federal government engages in these partnerships, usually they're providing, for example, the Onestead redevelopment received $295 million from CMHC. That development received in order to provide at least, I think it was 320 plus units in that particular development, which is going to be a development of roughly well over 2,000 housing units. But one of the things is that when they make these sort of agreements, those units only stay affordable for 25 years. And that's not a very long time. It's assuming that, people are only going to be suffering affordability problems for 25 years, and not recognizing that as the cost of living continues to goes up in this city or in other major cities across the country, wages continue to remain stagnant.
Okay, thank you, Nemoy. Next question is, what is the percentage of our rental properties in GTA under this institutional investment?
There isn't any exact figures.
Okay.
There isn't any exact figures yet, because a number of these institutional investors, there's so many that have gotten into this space, which was a space that used to be just occupied by real estate investment trusts. But now the space has, more investors have entered the space, which include a number of asset management firms or capital asset management firms, and hedge funds as well have got into the space. So there hasn't been exact numbers that have been made available in terms of the number of units they have under ownership.
Okay, thank you. Are there investment opportunities for Black economy in Canada to help mitigate some of this displacement?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Can you just repeat that question one more time?
Are there investment opportunities for, I guess I probably should have said, the Black economy in Canada to help mitigate some of this displacement?
I'm not aware of any that can help to mitigate, because it's hard to compete with institutional money, especially from pension funds who have billions and billions of dollars in their coffers to be, used to sort of make returns on their money. So unless one of the things that I'm trying to do with this work is to inform communities on how it might be the pension that they're investing in, through work, and how those pensions are being used to displace them from their community. And so getting pensioners to advocate that their pension systems defund or remove their investments from some of these private equity firms that engage in these practices.
Okay, I'll come back to. Thank you. The other question is, what is the common percentage of home ownership in an average white family's wealth, nuclear or several generations? Also, how long does it take to get up to middle class with no home ownership? So you want to break it in two then?
Yeah.
Okay, what is the common percentage of home ownership in an average white family's wealth, nuclear or several generations?
I don't think I have the exact
stats on that. Okay.
I don't think I have the stats. That's a very specific question, but whoever asked that question, feel free to reach out to me, and I could definitely get those numbers. I could definitely try to help to get those numbers.
Okay, and the second part is also how much or how long does it take to get up to middle class with no home ownership?
That's another specific.
About wealth, yeah, about wealth.
Yeah, that's another.
Okay, so I'm with that question. We can hold on. How come big non-profit organizations such as the United Way or Salvation Army are not investing much of their funds in building affordable housing? Should non-profits be at the front of stopping this gentrification and evictions?
I definitely think that they can, but as I mentioned,
resource
is the resource, right? When you're competing with a lot of institutional money from municipal pension funds and provincial pension funds, it's hard. And when you're competing also with the Canada Pension Investment Board, which is the largest pension fund that manages over 20 million citizens' pensions in this country, it's hard to compete with that.
Okay. Oh. Is the same information readily available for markets across Canada?
Not all markets. I know that it's available for it's now become available for Vancouver, but it's primarily been available for the Toronto and Montreal market. They've there's been a push towards making some of these making this information available in the Calgary and Edmonton area, where I believe Cap REIT, which is another real estate investment trust that has a significant number of properties within the province of Alberta, not so much of Saskatchewan or Manitoba.
Okay, thank you. Which comes to my, this is the question I had in mind. I was jotting some things. In your opinion, how can faith-based institutions help with this situation?
The one thing that I think that faith-based can help is through their own pension funds. I had an opportunity to take a look at where the investments that the Anglican pension fund, or the pension fund that or the institution that
Anglican
is
Church.
managing,
Yeah, the National Church, yeah.
That is managing that fund.
Okay.
And it seems like at the moment, there's a large sum of money that is right now approximately, I think it's about $52 million that is being invested in a real estate fund that is managed by TD that is also engaged in similar activities. So I would stress that, you know, individuals that that are either close to the board to take a look at some of the investments that are being made.
Okay, so we need to advocate for that, of course. Thank you, Nemoy. What would be your suggestion in terms of a response from the Anglican Diocese of Toronto, who holds significant real estate assets across the city and beyond? How can we help resist this financialization?
I think the one thing that, as I talked about earlier, is you know, is moving away from investment activities that sort of displace members of the congregation. I think you know, it's one thing that I think that it's important, but it's also, it could be making investments in even towards or doing joint partnerships or joint ventures with nonprofit organizations such as United Way and the Salvation Army, in using those funds in helping to construct purpose-built rentals within the city.
Okay, thank you. Let me continue. In your opinion, how can faith-based institutions help with this situation? So one thing you mentioned was joint ventures and so on, and advocating for the use of funds. Is there anything else we can do? You spoke about the 52 million in terms of the National Church invested in TD Bank and in these kinds of fashion.
It's a real estate fund called TD Greystone.
TD, okay.
Greystone.
Okay. The church has been quite vocal on a number of issues, including rent and minimum wage and other things. Do you think we have a role in the public sphere in addressing or speaking forthrightly to these things in a prophetic way?
I think that you can, and also supporting other initiatives and supporting other community organizations that are advocating on affordability, advocating on addressing issues of housing insecurity and affordability in the city. And there's a number of different organizations that are actively engaged in these in advocating these issues. So I think it's also supporting supporting these causes in in it might be speaking with the congregation in supporting these particular causes by helping to call your local political your local politician, either municipal, provincial, or federal elected officials, and getting them to be aware of these particular issues that are not only impacting some of the people that sit beside you, either at work or in the congregation, but helping to advocate as well for these issues, and also helping to come out to different events to supporting these grassroots organizations who are advocating for a more livable and affordable city.
This question is almost similar. What can we do as a faith community to address this issue with the various levels of government?
I think again, it's just really leveraging your I think it's really leveraging your contacts with various various political officials at various levels, to highlight the importance of this, highlight the importance of these issues and how it could be impacting the communities that the church is actively working in or operating.
Okay. And someone share. Ooh, this is more information. Share the case at CP Planning is someone Black investors might want to connect with. I'll move on as well. What about the Anglican Church pensions? You spoke about that in terms of that's the Anglican Church pension. You spoke about the 52 million.
Yes.
And TD. Okay, thanks. Let me go on. What are the somebody has something about the Anglican Church pensions again. Is there any role that Habitat for Humanity can play in providing affordable housing? The church has also contributed to that, I know, significantly. Anyway, your comments, Dr. Lewis.
I think that yes, I think that the church can continue to support the Habitat for Humanity, who's continuing to build affordable housing. It's just that the number of affordable housing that's needed at the scale that is needed to help to bridge those gaps and those shortfalls, and in those that those that do not have access to affordable housing, it will need a significant a lot of institutional capital to help solve some of these problems that are plaguing not just Black communities, but many racialized communities across the city.
Okay, so yes, the Anglican Church has been doing that. A few years ago, the Anglican Diocese teamed up with Habitat for Humanity to provide a few housing units in certain parts of the city. So confirming some of what you have said and the initiatives that way. I'll move on to the next question. Some years ago, government and community groups sponsored co-op housing projects across the country. Is that something that that they need to return to?
I definitely think that I definitely think that's something that the government needs to return to. It's just really advocating. It's really just advocating to your political officials to let it be known that it's a priority, and that it is prioritized on the campaign agendas when election time comes around. I think is something that needs to be done. I think that the government has made the federal government has made a number of initiatives in making in announcing that housing is a human right, but as long as it's not within our Constitution, it's almost like words without any teeth.
Okay, Okay, thank you. I'm going to end with that question. That one is the last question. We are at 8:59 or 8:59, and I want to thank Dr. Nemoy Lewis for taking the time to do this kind of forensic investigation into financialization of housing and the impact on the racialized group. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for coming out this evening. Just a few more things. Next week, we'll have the Reverend Alison Harris Singh, Assistant Curate at St. Martin's in the Fields. She'll be looking at the topic of overcoming the myth of the model minority. That's a good topic. Anti-Black racism in the South Asian community. And I hope you all can join us for next week's conversation.
Thank you very much. See you next week.
Thank you.
Yes, next week. Yes, blessings.